As we've seen earlier in this series, Scotsman Alexander MacDonald is regarded as the founding father of the production and sales of processed granite. His technological breakthrough in this area came about in the early 1830s and was made possible by one thing: the emergence of the steam engine. Thereafter, factory machines driven by these steam engines, as well as cutters for those machines and manual tools made out of hardened steel, made it possible and economically expedient to work and process granite on an unprecedented scale. Question: what technical achievement along the lines of steam engines underlies the breakthrough by Alexander MacDonald's colleague, Russian stonemason Samson Sukanow, who has been credited with the authorship of nearly half of all St. Petersburg granite? There's no answer to this question. The official chronicles report on the production of, for instance, the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral quite sparingly. All the labor involved in breaking down this granite, much as in ancient times, is accompanied only by the strength of the hands. Very well, let it be only by the strength of the hands, however hard it is to believe that, though we also need to consider that before humans learned to use and process granite in its natural form, in other words, before the tools and techniques for working with it appeared, granite was of interest to humans not only as a whole rock, but also as a source of granules. In other words, the crystal grains granite is composed of. Hence the origin of its name. Granite means grainy or consisting of grains. In Slavic languages, a different word was used to indicate granite, drezvianic. In other words, a stone that easily turns into drezva. While drezva, that's gravel and sand, is the product of the natural or artificial breakdown of drezvianic. Here is how various kinds of granite were described in a Russian source, the Rock Journal, 1895 issue. There exist several varieties of granite. In a petrographic sense, the main two are gray and pink, which differ in the orthoclase color. And further on, granites from the same deposit differ in the alternation of bands of hard and loose drezva stone, with extremely weak grain cohesion, easily crumbling into coarse sand. We'll make a note of the coarse sand. Often, drezva granites are widespread and dominant in this area, forming a kind of separate rock type made up of grains bound together. In the 19th century, Russian scientific dialogue included such terms as drezva stone and drezva granites, which easily crumbled into grains, and the grains in turn into coarse sand. Using the granite grains and granite sand as a base, people learned to prepare granite concrete and granite plaster. Therefore, Egyptian art revived in St. Petersburg is the revival of the production of artificial rather than natural granite. Otherwise, a glaring historical inconsistency arises that can be illustrated, for instance, in this way. Let's consider for a minute the Wright brothers, those American pioneers in the field of aviation. Let us suppose that when they took that first flight on a glider installed with an internal combustion engine in North Carolina, that Russian aviators had already crossed the Arctic Ocean and landed in Vancouver 20 years earlier. It is precisely in this way that the first polished granite slabs made for Alexander MacDonald's monuments, 1832, correspond to the 56 columns of the Kazan Cathedral, 1811. The fact that Samson Sukanow worked his granite by hand, while Alexander MacDonald used factory machines and steam engines, makes no difference whatsoever to this analogy. Manufacturing, whether it involves manual labor as it did in the case of Sukanow and his stonemasons, is still an industrial process. So one would have thought that the Russian Sukanow, and not the Briton MacDonald, would be given the credit for being first. But neither British nor Russian historians consider Sukanow to be a pioneer in the field of granite work, and certainly don't rank him alongside MacDonald. Why ever not? That means it's inappropriate to compare them. Perhaps because they worked with granite that differed in quality, one with natural granite, the other with artificial granite. There is direct proof that Sukanow worked with artificial granite. This proof is to be found in the very center of Moscow, in Red Square. the monument of Minin and Pozarsky, the granite pedestal for which was produced by the same St. Petersburg stonemason, Samson Sukhanow. The pedestal of the foremost monument of the Russian Empire, it symbolizes the beginning of the Romanov dynasty's rule, is made out of Finnish Repikivi granite, which, as previously stated, means rotten stone in translation. And here's what's most remarkable. Almost all Sukhanow's creations are made out of this rotten granite. Repikivi granite belongs to the class of coarse-grained granites. What does this mean? It means the following. Let's read detailed guidance for engineers on granite applications, a rather official document of the Imperial Ministry, in the Journal of Communication Routes from 1842. Granite can be coarse-grained, medium-grained, or finely fine-grained. Coarse-grained granite becomes weathered and is not suitable for cutting. End of quotation. Here you have another contradiction. Coarse-grained granite does not survive for long outdoors, becomes weathered, and is unsuitable for cutting. In other words, for being worked on with tools. Meanwhile, the Great Soviet Encyclopedia calls it a valuable building material, one that the granite blocks of the Neva's riverbanks and the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral are made of, and the pedestal of the monument to Minin and Pozarsky, which is hollow on the inside. Why was it hollowed out? Where was the need for that, unless it was to make it lighter and easier to transport? But hiring good stonemasons is a much more expensive matter than mere transport, and the granite could have cracked with such thin walls. Why take such a risk, especially given that even 30 years later, after the production of this pedestal, Repikivi was considered a poor stone for working on with manual tools. But everything immediately falls into place if this pedestal was produced using the technology of granite concrete being placed into a formwork. It's possible to see the boundary between two adjacent pours if we look at the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral from a certain angle. Something similar also peeks out from the Alexander column. This is not surprising. It was necessary to wait until the lower section of concrete set before the next section could be poured. Although the visible boundaries between pours were carefully polished away, traces of them nevertheless still remain. Officially, the body of the Alexander column was put in place after it was already finished. Montferrand's drawings of the stages of the column's construction might have been plain misinformation intended to wow the public with the Russian master's ability to work with and move granite boulders weighing many tons, while simultaneously concealing from foreign competitors the secret behind St. Petersburg's monumental granite masterpieces, whose golden age began in the 1760s with the construction of the palace embankment alongside the Winter Palace. Industrial spaces and sources of power would have been necessary for producing such a quantity of blocks of various sizes out of artificial granite. But where were they located? Of course, moving the finished granite blocks from afar would have been troublesome to say the least, so their production must have been located nearby, or at least not far from the intended construction site. Note that the surfaces of the blocks of the palace embankment, the first granite embankment in St. Petersburg, are complex. Obviously, these weren't carved out with a manual tool. That's expensive and inefficient, but rather created in special molds similar to those used when children play with plasticine. Regarding the first granite construction sites, the Peter and Paul Fortress and the Palace Embankment, a source previously mentioned in these films tells us, the bank of the Neva from the Foundry Yard to the corner of Galerny Street, measuring 1,650 sazen in length, over 3 verstas, in other words, over 3 kilometers, with the exception of the Admiralty, is paved with granite together with all the reinforcements and sidewalks. The Foundry Yard mentioned here is marked with the number 17 on a 1756 map of St. Petersburg. The Palace Embankment is denoted by the red line. By the way, on the topic of cannonballs, which were made not only out of metal, but also out of stone, the official position is that the use of stone cannonballs in Russian artillery ended in the 16th century. However, in the 1711 edition of the Study and Practice of Artillery, which is essentially the artillery charter published by the mandate of His Royal Majesty Peter the Great, stone cannonballs are mentioned alongside iron and lead cannonballs. And there is also mention of stone cannonballs in an earlier similar charter from the beginning of the 17th century, which was reprinted in the time of Catherine II, in the context of explaining that stone cannonballs can be produced in two ways: by hewing stones if the gunner is familiar with stonework, or if not, by baking the cannonballs in the oven like bricks. But the material these cannonballs were baked out of is not mentioned. Clay is unlikely. Ceramic cannonballs were never used by the artillery in view of this material's lightness and fragility. Likewise, in the same artillery charter, various chemical substances necessary for preparing gunpowder are mentioned multiple times, including saltpeter and ammonia. We've already seen that ammonia was mainly supplied to Europe from Egypt from the 15th to the 19th century inclusive. The General Chemistry by Ferdinand Ivanovich Geiss, published in Russia in 1815, tells us that until recently, Egypt had been the exclusive producer and supplier of ammonia. And Europe was supplied with saltpeter primarily from Egypt as well, where it was mined in a simpler and more cost-effective way than in other countries. Egypt, Samsun-Sukanal, granite, St. Petersburg, and ammonia, in other words, ammonium chloride, all together in a bust of Jupiter Ammon, with, to top it off, a view of Kazan Cathedral with its granite columns by Samsun-Sukanal. But why wouldn't we connect stone cannonballs with the foundry yard in a similar way? Where else, but at a foundry yard, could stone cannonballs be baked in an oven like bricks? Quite often, new technologies make their first appearance in a military setting. Only later do they find themselves applied to civilian purposes. By the way, who produced these granite cannonballs? In other words, the spheres mounted on the Strelka of the Vasilevsky Island in St. Petersburg. You have 3 guesses. Clearly, this is the direction in which we need to look for Samsun-Sukanal's recipe for artificial granite. Granite, natural granite, consists of various types of feldspars, quartz, and mica. And quartz sand, as we know, is a raw material for glass smelting. So if artificial granite is granite grains in glass, then such artificial granite is practically a perfect copy of natural granite in its chemistry, shape, and crystal content. And glass can be obtained in 2 ways. Thermally, in other words, by melting quartz sand at approximately 1000 degrees Celsius, or a little over 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, in special ovens. This was and still remains the main method of creating glass objects. And chemically, which was described in sources from the first half of the 19th century. Silica, when turned into a fine powder, dissolves in alkaline brines, but only if boiled for a long time. And boiling liquids means more or less 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water. This is my addendum. Compound of silica with alkalis of potassium and sodium is easy to obtain via a dry method. All that is required is to dissolve sand with carbonic alkali, and glass is obtained. And further on in the same source, if we use less alkali and more silica, we obtain glass that is undissolvable or dissolvable to a lesser degree. Perhaps ammonia, as, let me remind you, symbolized by the bust of Jupiter Ammon in the study of St. Petersburg's main alchemist, Count Stroganov, was a key ingredient for the preparation of artificial granite. For example, when adding it to a mixture of quartz sand and alkali, potassium and sodium alkali, this mixture sets faster and became more durable. This is exactly where the secret of the longevity of St. Petersburg's granite, seemingly made from the rotten Repakivi stone, is found. Every individual crystal is enveloped in glass, protecting the entire granite cast from penetration by water or air. Grigory Gagarin's painting depicts the construction of the Alexander Column during the winter of 1832-33. The column is already standing, but its base is covered by some kind of brick structure in the process of being dismantled. Obviously, This used to be a workshop for granite craftsmen, where they manufactured parts for the column. But which parts? Likely those that couldn't be made in a regular workshop, so arrangements were made for their production directly at the site of construction. After mounting the column, all that was left was to secure the bas-relief plates and decorative elements to the pedestal, as well as to complete the final work and polishing on the column, as an official source tells us. But to secure the bas-relief plates and decorative elements to the pedestal and to polish the column for the last time, is it really necessary to build a substantial structure with narrow windows, so as to complete these, generally speaking, trivial tasks in the dark? And what is that piled under the wall and powdered over with snow? Is it sand? For what? For building this temporary structure? But it's being taken apart already. Why wasn't the excess sand removed immediately after completing the construction of this brick structure? The sovereign emperor himself watched over the progress of construction of the column named after his older brother from the windows of the Winter Palace. And no doubt, he came personally to see how work was proceeding on more than one occasion, so as to not lose face before the European monarchs, since he had undertaken to build the tallest triumphal column in the world at that time. That's not to mention the army of overseers who stuck their nose into everything. There's no doubt that there would have been perfect order at the construction site with nothing at all out of place. Anybody who served in the army knows what I'm talking about. Most likely, this was that very quartz sand that was mixed with various alkalis and other secret ingredients. Granite craftsmen prepared a dough-like mixture based around alkali and sand, to which granite grains were added. And then the mixture was carefully placed in a formwork like this, layer by layer. After the hardening of the granite concrete, the formwork was removed, and a new one was placed at a higher level. Whereas for columns of a smaller size, something like this was used, but the principle was the same. To save the expensive granite mixture, the middle may have been filled with cheap concrete out of rocks and shells mixed with lime cement. Portland cement was invented later. To conclude this film, as promised earlier, I will tell you the story of the ancient Egyptian sphinxes on St. Petersburg's University embankment. Their history is of interest because they have no history outside the limits of the city in which they are mounted. Officially, the line is that they were found on the ruins of Tanis, an ancient city in the Nile Delta, by the well-known 19th century Egyptologist Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But Rousseau himself didn't know where he had found them and wrote nothing about them in his memoirs. The only mentions made are of one sphinx made out of sandstone and the discoveries of the fragments of other sphinxes. But what about the Great Sphinx in the Louvre, which was also found by Rousseau? There is no mention of that sphinx in Rousseau's memoirs either. The Egyptologist has been credited with finding what he never did. Now that you know how ancient Egyptian history and ancient Egyptian artifacts were created, with that, the topic of Egypt is done with, and in future films, we will examine the equally utterly false history of pre-Columbian America. Now I want to introduce you to my book, The Other History of the Roman Empire, which has already become a bestseller in Russian. In this book, I will talk about the reasons for the 1500-year extension of the history of Christianity, and along with the history of Christianity, the history of all humanity was extended, resulting in the so-called Middle Ages, which Western European historians of the 17th and 18th centuries filled with historical texture purely on paper. Roman popes, also known as the Great Pontiffs of the 15th to 17th centuries, were also emperors. For example, Emperor Trajan, born Giulio de' Medici at the height of his military and political career, became the Great Pontiff, that is, the Pope of Rome, under the name Clement VII. The tombs of Roman popes from the 15th to 17th centuries are adorned with ancient Roman goddesses, which have nothing to do with Christianity, and which historians modestly call virtues. Apparently, the ancient Roman deity Triton, on which Pope Urban VIII placed his coat of arms, also belongs to such virtues. By reading this book, you will learn that Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great lived in the 15th century. Julius Caesar was indeed a pagan, even though he was a great pontiff, that is, the Pope of Rome, while Alexander the Great was a pre-Christian monotheist and visited the Temple of the Lord in Jerusalem as a pilgrim. The cross was a pre-Christian symbol of the Church. Jesus Christ did not live in the 1st century, as historians assure us, but in the 15th, at the end of which the Julian calendar was established by Pope Julius II, also known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian Augustus. Do not pay attention to the years of his pontificate. I found evidence that historians deliberately shifted them 8 years closer to us, so that Julius II would not be associated with the Julian calendar. The link to the book and its table of contents can be found at the bottom in the description. That's all for me. I appreciate your time and attention and wish you all the best. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and let's stay connected. Respectfully, Alexander Tomansky.